1845, the great arrival of the Irish who changed America forever. In 1845, something invisible landed on the west coast of Ireland and began killing everything it touched. The fungus known as Phytophthora infestans spread through potato fields across the island within weeks, turning crops black and soft in the ground before farmers could harvest a single root. What happened next would permanently alter the population of an entire nation and reshape a country 3,000 miles away that most Irish people had never seen. Ireland in 1845 was already a country stripped to the bone. It was the only nation in Europe governed by a foreign power, ruled by Britain for centuries with virtually no manufacturing sector and no independent economy. The vast majority of the rural population survived almost entirely on the potato, not as a preference, but as the only food available to the landless poor. When the blight arrived, there was no backup, there was no reserve, there was nothing. And the question that historians still debate today is whether what followed was a famine, a policy failure, or something closer to a deliberate abandonment. Between 1845 and 1855, approximately 2.1 million people, 1/4 of Ireland's entire population, left their homeland permanently. 1 million more died. The island that had held 8.2 million people in 1841 would never again reach that number. Something had broken that could not be repaired, and the people who survived it were already moving. The blight that erased a population. The potato blight of 1845 did not arrive without warning. It had already devastated crops in Belgium and the Netherlands. But Ireland had no system in place to absorb the shock. The fungus, Phytophthora infestans, destroyed the entire potato harvest in 1846, the second consecutive year of failure. By late 1846, Ireland was in the grip of a historic famine, and the British government's response was catastrophically insufficient. Food, grain, cattle, butter continued to be exported from Ireland to Britain even as people starved in the fields. Public works programs were set up but paid wages too low to buy food. Soup kitchens were eventually established but reached only a fraction of those dying. The county of Mayo recorded one of the most dramatic population collapses. From 388,887 people in 1841 to 274,830 by 1851. That is more than 114,000 people gone in 10 years, dead or departed. The blight did not kill equally. It killed the poor, the landless, the Catholic tenant farmers who had no legal rights to the land they worked and no political voice to demand help. Landlords across the country found it cheaper to pay a family's passage to North America than to continue feeding them on relief. Entire townlands were cleared. Entire communities ceased to exist. Ireland's population has never recovered to its pre-famine numbers, not in any year since 1845. Coffin ships carried the dying westward. The ships that carried Irish emigrants across the Atlantic in the late 1840s earned their name through documented death rates that shocked even a century accustomed to brutal sea travel. Most Irish emigrants could not afford passage on American vessels, which had higher standards and better conditions. Instead, they boarded British cargo ships, timber ships returning empty to North America after delivering their loads in British ports, converted hastily to carry human beings at minimum cost. Owners provided as little food, water, and living space as the law allowed, and frequently less. In July of 1847 alone, 10 vessels arrived at the quarantine station of Grosse Isle in Canada, carrying 4,427 Irish emigrants. 804 had died during the crossing. 847 arrived sick. By the end of that year, the toll across 441 ships was staggering: 5,293 dead at sea, 8,072 dead at Grosse Isle in Quebec, and 7,000 more dead in and above Montreal. At least 20,365 people who left Ireland and never reached their destination alive. The British government had deliberately incentivized travel to Canada over the United States by offering discounted fares of 15 shillings instead of 100. Thousands took those cheaper tickets, knowing the risks. Once in Canada, the survivors crossed the border on foot and made their way to the nearest American city, usually Boston or New York, with nothing except the clothes they crossed in. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about this video. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. 300 Irish landed daily in New York. At the peak of the famine migration, 300 Irish emigrants were disembarking in New York City every single day. They arrived at Castle Garden, the processing center at the southern tip of Manhattan, weak from weeks at sea, carrying whatever had survived the crossing. By 1850, the United States held 961,719 Irish-born citizens, 43% of the entire foreign-born population of the country. 70% of all Irish immigrants who reached the United States settled in 7 northern states: New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Massachusetts. They chose cities because they had no money to go anywhere else. A train ticket west cost more than most arriving families possessed. New York absorbed the largest share. By 1855, 26% of Manhattan's entire population was Irish-born. A decade earlier, that figure had been a fraction of that number. The transformation of the city happened faster than anyone in government had planned for or could manage. The Irish clustered in the cheapest available housing, basements, attics, converted warehouses, in lower Manhattan, in neighborhoods along the waterfront, where the first jobs were found. They came speaking Irish or heavily accented English, Catholic in a Protestant-dominated city, poor in a country that regarded poverty as a personal failing. They arrived not as immigrants seeking opportunity, but as refugees seeking survival. That distinction shaped everything that came next. 5 Points, the slum that swallowed thousands. 5 Points was a neighborhood at the intersection of 5 streets in lower Manhattan: Orange, Cross, Anthony, Little Water, and Mulberry, and by the 1850s it had become the most densely populated and most dangerous neighborhood in the United States. The Irish did not create 5 Points, but the famine migration transformed it. Some dwellings in the neighborhood housed 100 people, sharing a single sink and a single toilet. Entire families lived in basement rooms below street level, with no natural light and no ventilation. Disease moved through the buildings like fire. In 1849, a cholera epidemic struck Boston. 500 of the 611 people who died were Irish. In New York, the mortality rates in Irish immigrant neighborhoods exceeded those in any other part of the city. 60% of children born to Irish immigrants in Boston died before the age of 6. Adult Irish immigrants lived an average of only 6 years after arriving in the United States. The conditions produced predictable social consequences. Young Irish men formed street gangs. Crime rates in Irish neighborhoods were documented extensively, and exaggerated even more extensively by newspapers and cartoonists who depicted the Irish as brutish, drunken, and subhuman. Thomas Nast's cartoons in major publications portrayed Irish immigrants with ape-like features. The stereotypes imported from Britain arrived in America fully formed and found a ready audience. What was rarely documented with equal intensity was the structural cause. a population that had survived famine, crossed an ocean on plague ships, and arrived in a country with no housing, no jobs, and no assistance waiting for them. No Irish need apply, but work. Anyway, the signs appeared in shop windows, in newspaper classified advertisements, and on factory gates across Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. No Irish need apply. The phrase was not a legal policy. It was a cultural signal, and it communicated clearly that Irish Catholics were considered a lower order of person by the Protestant Anglo-Saxon establishment that dominated American cities in the 1850s. Irish women attempting to enter the textile mills of Lowell, Massachusetts, found themselves segregated from the Yankee Protestant workers who had previously held those jobs. The discrimination extended into hospitals, cemeteries, and public schools, where Protestant teachers actively undermined Catholic practice. In Boston, Irish Catholics were prohibited from burying their dead in public cemeteries. When a Catholic parochial school system was proposed, the Protestant-run Boston School Committee blocked it. And yet the Irish worked. They took every job that native-born Americans refused. They dug canals in temperatures that killed men. They laid railroad tracks across plains and mountains. They worked the docks, pushed carts, cleaned houses, cooked meals, and built the physical infrastructure of American cities for wages that kept them permanently at the edge of survival. If a worker was injured on a railroad, he was fired. If he was killed, his family received nothing. The labor was essential to the expanding American economy, and the people providing it were treated as expendable. The Irish understood this transaction completely. They accepted it because there was no alternative, and they remembered it. The canals and rails Irish hands built. By 1860, approximately 4,000 miles of canals had been cut across the American landscape, and the overwhelming majority of that earth had been moved by Irish immigrant labor. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, had been built largely by Irish workers and connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, opening the interior of the continent to commercial trade. After the canals came the railroads. The same men who had dug the canals moved directly onto the rail crews, laying tracks across the eastern seaboard, then into the Midwest, then toward the Pacific. The expression circulating among railway workers was precise and grim. An Irishman was buried under every tie. There are no official records of immigrant deaths on construction sites, but estimates for the New Basin Canal in New Orleans alone range from 8,000 to 30,000 workers killed, many buried in unmarked graves in the levee, and roadway fill beside the canal. The work was deliberately designed to consume the cheapest available labor. Contractors bid on projects knowing that Irish workers would accept conditions that native-born Americans would refuse. The hours were unlimited. The safety standards were non-existent. When the economy turned down in the mid-1850s, employers reduced wages and increased workloads simultaneously. The Irish had no legal recourse, no union protection, and no political representation capable of challenging the system. What they were building, however, was not only infrastructure. They were building a presence, a physical claim on American soil made in labor, in blood, and in the dead left in the ground beneath the roads they built. 150,000 men went to war. When the Civil War began in 1861, more than 150,000 Irishmen, the majority of them recent immigrants, many not yet American citizens, enlisted in the Union Army. Some enlisted out of genuine loyalty to their new country. Others calculated that a conspicuous display of military sacrifice might reduce the discrimination they faced at home. The most famous Irish fighting force was the New York Irish Brigade, composed of the 63rd, 69th, and 88th New York Infantry Regiments. At the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, The Irish Brigade charged up Mary's Heights under direct artillery and rifle fire, suffering 41.4% casualties in a single engagement. Ireland produced 18 generals during the Civil War, 12 for the Union and 6 for the Confederacy, more than any other foreign nation. Then came the Enrollment Act of March 1863, which allowed any drafted man to pay $300 to hire a substitute. $300 was an impossible sum for Irish dock workers earning less than $1 a day. When the first draft list appeared in July of 1863, it was clear that Irish wards were supplying a disproportionate share of conscripts, while wealthier neighborhoods bought their way out. The result was 4 days of riots in New York City, the largest civilian insurrection in American history. More than 100 people died. At least 120 of the victims were African American. Union troops returning from Gettysburg were deployed to restore order. Tammany Hall gave the Irish their power. It took less than 1 generation for the Irish to convert their numbers into political force. The mechanism was Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party political machine that had operated in New York since the 1790s, and that the Irish transformed into the most powerful urban political organization in American history. Tammany worked on a simple exchange: votes for services. Ward bosses, local organizers who knew every family in their district, provided jobs, housing referrals, food assistance, and help navigating the legal system to newly arrived immigrants. In return, those immigrants voted as directed. The Irish brought to this system something they had developed against the British: a genius for mass political mobilization, tight communal loyalty, and a clear understanding that collective power was the only protection available to people without individual resources. After Boss Tweed's corruption conviction in 1872, an Irish-American named John Kelly took control of Tammany and rebuilt it into a more disciplined machine. From that point forward, Irish Americans dominated New York City's political and civil service apparatus for over a century. Police and fire department rosters were dominated by Irish officers from the commissioners down to the rank and file. Every cardinal and senior Catholic clergy member in the city's history was Irish American. In 1928, Tammany's greatest political product, New York Governor Alfred Smith, became the first Catholic ever nominated for the presidency by a major American political party. 33 million descendants still call America home. Today, more than 33 million Americans identify as having Irish ancestry, making the Irish the second largest ethnic group of European origin in the United States. The transformation from famine refugee to political and cultural cornerstone took approximately 3 generations. The people who arrived starving in New York and Boston in 1846 had grandchildren who ran city governments, led police departments, commanded military units, and shaped the Democratic Party for the entire 20th century. The Catholic Church in the United States was built almost entirely by Irish immigrant labor, money, and organization, a parallel institution that provided education, social services, and community structure in cities where the Protestant establishment excluded Irish Catholics from every other institution. The labor movement that eventually produced the 40-hour work week, workplace safety regulations, and collective bargaining rights drew enormously from Irish immigrant organizing traditions forged in the worst conditions American industry ever imposed on its workforce. The political machine tradition that the Irish perfected in Tammany Hall established the template for urban democratic politics that persisted through the New Deal, through the Kennedy administration, and into the late 20th century. The famine that began in 1845 killed 1 million people and displaced 2 million more. It emptied counties, erased communities, and reduced Ireland to a population it has never recovered. What it also did, unintentionally, through sheer desperation, was seed the United States with a group of people who had survived the unsurvivable, and who had every reason to fight for what they built next.